Let's get the show on the road. Welcome everyone to this first Nuclear Proliferation International History Project webinar. I'm Christian Osterman. I'm the co-director of the NPHP along with Leopoldo Nuti of Roma Tre University, who is also online. It's great to see so many of you, or at least see your name listed on the participants list, and hopefully we'll get to talk and see you as part of the discussion later in the seminar. Leopoldo Nuti and I are delighted to feature a discussion of Marty Sherwin's important new book as the first in a series of webinars that will present new work by the NPHP community. We hope to hold these webinars on a monthly basis after September 1st, and we welcome ideas for topics and presentations. We're particularly interested in featuring new work by our bootcamp alumni. The NPHP always has the NPHP experience always has been one of sharing, exchanging ideas and findings from the boot camps to the workshops to the publications. And so while we cannot do that in person right now, all of you know we had to postpone the boot camp. We want to provide a platform to still come together and share ideas. And so we hope this series will help continue to foster a sense of community within the NPHP during this time of distancing and travel bans. This webinar series will be one of a number of new activities which we will be rolling out in the coming weeks and months, so please stay tuned. A big thank you to Marty and his co-panelists, which Jordana will introduce shortly, for allowing us to pull this together at fairly short notice. And thanks especially to Jordana Pulcini, who most of you know. She teaches history of transatlantic relations at Roma Tre University, and of course is an expert and published author on US arms control and non-proliferation policy during the Cold War. Thanks to Peter Bierstecker and the team at the Wilson Center that's working behind the scenes to manage the technical side of this. They have, well, first let me just also say a big thank you to the Carnegie Corporation, which has funded the NPHP for the past decade, and a big shout out to Carl Robichaud and Karim Kamel for their steadfast support. One request by our people on the technical side: please mute yourself. You can leave the video in, but mute yourself until you're called upon by the moderator, and be sure you use the chat function on the Zoom to pose your questions. Jordana may read some of them or call on some of you, but for clarity's sake, we'd like to have the questions also in the chat function. With that, let me ask Poldo, do you have any additional words of welcome or wisdom?
Thank you very much, Christian. I'm Leopoldo Nuti. I am the co-director of the NPHP project together with Christian. As most of you who are attending this webinar probably know by now, and I'm delighted to see so many of you with us today. This is not the ideal replacement for meeting in person, as we place a great importance to that kind of experience in the project, but it's the best we can do for the time being. And I cannot think of a better opportunity to get this started than doing it with Marty's book, with the presentation of Marty's book. So I'm really looking forward to doing this. I'm very excited by the list of people who have joined us today, and I look forward to the next hour and a half.
Wonderful. Thank you, Poldo. And with that, it's over to Jordana for the moderation of this panel. Jordana.
Thank you, Christian. Thank you, Poldo, and my warmest greetings to the NPIHP community. Thank you for joining us. I'm really happy to see you all, and I hope that you are all staying safe and well. As Christian and Poldo mentioned, in the past months, the NPIHP had to postpone a number of events, including, of course, the boot camp. But I'm sure that the community is staying well and alive. So, and this is an opportunity to see each other and keep exchanging ideas and keep the discussion on nuclear history open. And especially today with the discussion on Marty's book. Say that I don't want to steal more time to the panel. I'm really delighted and excited to have the opportunity to moderate this event. We will discuss Marty Sherwin's upcoming book, Gambling with Armageddon, Nuclear Roulette from Hiroshima to the Cuban Missile Crisis, 1945-1962. I'm sure you all know Marty. He's a senior scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Center and a professor of history at George Mason University, and one of the pillars of the NPIHP since its beginning. This will really be organized as a conversation between Marty, the three distinguished commentators, but it will also include all of you that could join us today. So feel free to ask your questions, and in a moment I'll repeat some of the rules that were already introduced by Christians. Let me say a few words on our three speakers today. Michael Dobbs was a longtime reporter for the Washington Post. Svetlana Savranskaya is senior analyst at the National Security Archive and director of the Archives Russia program. And David Holloway has been for many years professor of international history and political science at Stanford University, and he himself is another one of the NPIHP pillars, as I said about Marty. I'm not going to add much more on them, as I'm sure that you all know who they are, and if you need more details, you can easily search for their biographies online and even on the Wilson Center websites. Let me just repeat some of the rules and how this is going to happen. First of all, Marty will give a brief introduction about the book with some highlights, about 5 minutes, and then I'll ask the commentators to give some remarks. Please keep your remarks to 3, maximum 5 minutes to allow a smooth conversation, and I'll give Marty a chance to respond to each comment before going on with the next question and with the next comments. No more than 45 minutes after we start the panel, I'll introduce the questions and the comments from the rest of the audience. As Christian said, please write your questions into the Zoom chat. So if we have, this will help in case we have a bad connection on the reception is not clear. I might read your questions, or I might call on you to pose your question directly. This will depend on the discussion and on the moment. Keep your comments and questions short. And if you're using a nickname for your Zoom account, please write down your name on the Zoom chat together with the question. Last but not least, please, I repeat what Christian already said, mute your microphones. We cannot mute your microphones, so keep them muted. And I unmute, and please unmute it only when I call on you. And I think that's all. I apologize for all these lengthy rules, but I think this will help to make for fruitful and engaging discussion. And without further delay, I leave it to Marty to give us some of the highlights of this book. Thank you, Marty.
Thank you, Giordana. Can everybody hear me okay? Yes? Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. First of all, thank you, Poldo and Christian, for this honor, really, to open up the seminar series. And welcome to all of you. It's so great to see you. This has made my summer not a good substitute for the boot camp, but it'll have to do, and it's very, very nice. The other thing I should say is that this book, Gambling with Armageddon, Nuclear Roulette from Hiroshima to the Cuban Missile Crisis, could not possibly have been written without the support of the Woodrow Wilson Center and my participation in the boot camp. When you boot campers have a chance to read this, I hope, you'll see David's views in there. You'll see Giordana's views in there. You'll see Poldo's views, Christian's views. It really is a product of my experiences even before the boot camp got started. Like all my other books, they've taken an incredibly long time, and I hope the pickling process has produced some good dividends. Let me say just a few words about the book so I can quickly get to the conversation with the three panelists. I began the book with the idea that it would focus on the military and the Cuban Missile Crisis. That, as far as I knew, had never really been done in any depth, and I thought that that would be an interesting contribution. Well, I no sooner got into the issue, and I realized two things. First, I discovered that all of the Joint Chiefs of Staff minutes of their meetings during the Cuban Missile Crisis had been destroyed in 1976. There were notes taken on the actual minutes, and they survived. But the real details that would be necessary to dig into the foundation of all of the thinking that was going on in the Joint Chiefs of Staff had been lost to history. The other thing was that I realized something I should have known from the beginning. Writing about the military and a decision like the decisions that involve the Cuban Missile Crisis, without also probing and analyzing the civilian context, didn't make a lot of sense. So the book expanded to really a study of what we do in the boot camp. We look at all of these decisions from Hiroshima onward. So that's the framework for the book. A couple of comments about what I was surprised about. I've been lecturing on the Eisenhower administration for as long as I can remember, but I had not done any deep research into Eisenhower's thinking about nuclear weapons. And frankly, I was appalled. I had, like so many other people, when I was a young professor back in the 1960s and 70s, thought that John Foster Dulles had manipulated everything. And then the revisionism of the Eisenhower administration showed that Eisenhower, in fact, was much more in charge than we had originally suspected. But I had no idea how devoted during his first administration Eisenhower was to nuclear weapons as sort of the silver bullet that would allow him to conduct foreign policy the way he wanted to, and provide an instrument for controlling Soviet behavior. So that was one thing. The other thing, and this will be my last comment, the relationship between Kennedy and his ambassador to the UN, Adlai Stevenson, has always been problematic. And Stevenson's reputation was more or less destroyed after the Cuban Missile Crisis by an article in the Saturday Review, I think it was, that said Stevenson wanted a Munich. He was a disaster during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Well, it turns out that Kennedy himself had penciled in on a draft of that article the comment that Stevenson wanted a Munich. It turned out, on close investigation, that Stevenson was the architect of the resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the peaceful resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis. I think I'll leave it at that. Of course, there's a lot more, but that's going to come out when David and Svetlana and Michael make their comments and questions and conversation. So thank you.
Thank you, Marty. I think we have sort of two fingers from Cape Verde, which so I'm going to ask you his question, and then we will move to our commentators. So please keep the answer very brief. Who destroyed the Joint Chiefs notes on the missile crisis, and why a clerical error?
Nobody knows for certain, but I am convinced it was 1976 during the Church Committee hearings into the government interference in public affairs, the COINTELPRO situation. And I think the Joint Chiefs burned their minutes, fearing that the Church Committee was going to subpoena them.
Okay, thank you, Marty, for the quick reply. And I'll leave it to Michael Dobbs now. He needs to leave us, unfortunately, a bit earlier, around 1 p.m. or maybe even 10 minutes earlier. So he will go first with his first comment or question.
Okay, thank you very much, Marty. It's a wonderful book, but I'm going to dispense with the praise as we've been instructed. I have 3 comments, which are also questions for you. So I'm going to just ask one after the other and let you reply to each one. So I was interested by the way you set up this debate at the beginning within the US government between the people who wanted to cooperate with Russia and the people who didn't. And you frame this as Stimson versus Burns. You know, in a way, this is the old debate about who was responsible for the Cold War. Particularly, you draw attention to a very interesting meeting in September 1945, when Stimson, the defense secretary, makes a case for bringing Russia, cooperating more closely with Russia, and he says that this could actually influence future democratic developments in Russia. And I'm wondering whether, of course, this is a hypothetical question, but had Truman sided with Stimson rather than with Burns, history might have been different, or whether Stalin was so set in his ways and determined to play by the rules, the game by his rules, that it wouldn't have made any difference. I'd also be interested in David Holloway's view on that. Thank you.
I agree. Until you got to David Holloway, I was going to say we need to talk to David about that. My view is the atomic bombs were used on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The possibility of Stalin not committing to a crash program to build nuclear weapons had gone by the board. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were the events that precipitated everything that came afterwards. If Stimson argument had won out, it's possible that things could have proceeded in a more cooperative manner, but I think Stalin still would have been committed to building nuclear weapons.
Thank you, Marty. Svetlana, would you like to give your first remark, comment, question? I think you're muted.
Unmuted. Yes. Yes. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be with everybody and see everybody. I enjoyed reading the book immensely. I'll keep my praise short. I think the biggest lessons that I draw from the book is the lesson that empathy is absolutely necessary, and absence of empathy can lead to terrible outcomes. Marty also shows how little control of events leaders have in crisis situation, and how often they rely on information that is not true information, not objective. So here's my first question, and this is about the Berlin factor. What struck me in my research on the Cuban Missile Crisis is that you read American documents, and it's really interesting how much the Kennedy administration members, ex-com, pretty much everybody talks about the Berlin, possible Russian response to Berlin as even a reason, one of the major reasons of placing missiles in Cuba. And this view is also widespread in the scholarly literature. And if you read the Soviet documents of the time, Berlin almost never comes up, very, very rarely in the discussions of the Presidium and the cables. in Mikoyan materials that I studied. So I think in his book, Marty shows the importance of Berlin to the American thinking, but it seems to be one of those false knowns, as he describes. So why is that? How would you explain that the Americans so misinterpreted Russian intentions in Berlin, if you think they misinterpreted?
I don't think that, well, thank you for that. Very interesting framework for the question, Svetlana. I don't think that Kennedy misinterpreted Soviet interest in Berlin, because it's clear that Khrushchev was, as Secretary of State Russ said in one of the ex-com meetings, almost irrational about Berlin. He had made that point in 1958, 1959 to Eisenhower. At Vienna, he was very aggressive about Berlin with Kennedy. So Kennedy was focused on the idea that everything that Khrushchev did, was related to Berlin. It turned out, I think, and this is debatable, that Khrushchev had compartmentalized Cuba and Berlin when he decided to put the missiles in Cuba. Now, in the scholarly literature, for example, argues very strongly that he put the missiles in Cuba with an eye towards Berlin. But I have no doubt that if he had succeeded in Cuba, he would have used that as leverage to raise the Berlin issue. But I think first and foremost, Khrushchev's focus was on making sure the United States could not invade Cuba again.
Right, but would you agree that the Kennedy administration misinterpreted Khrushchev's willingness to strike at Berlin if there was any action on Cuba? And
yes.
I mean, Berlin as a factor in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Certainly Berlin was extremely important for Khrushchev, and he was obsessed about Berlin, but it seems like after the wall was built, the importance of Berlin in the Soviet decision-making significantly cooled down and was not a factor in the placing of the missiles or response.
I think it was, at best a minor factor. As Kennedy said, if Khrushchev intends to take Berlin, why would he build a wall? Right. Neither Kennedy nor Khrushchev wanted a war. They both wanted their goals met without a war. They were willing to threaten each other, but they tried to understand exactly where that line is that you can't cross over. And Khrushchev was terrified that the discovery of the missiles was going to lead to crossing that line. So he was not going to probe Berlin and make things more difficult. Absolutely. On the other hand, from Kennedy's point of view, he might do it. And if he does it, what am I going to do? I think that was the situation. But it's probably a good general lesson that whenever you get into disagreements like that, whenever you get into a crisis, you never have enough information to make a really clear decision. And to bring things to the present, I'm beginning to worry seriously about US relations with China, you know, and the same sort of thing. We just don't know what's in, you know, in their heads, and they don't know what's in our heads. And it's very, very dangerous.
I'm very sorry to interrupt you, but Michael needs to leave us soon, and so I would ask him to go on with his other two questions. David, would you like to say something about Stalin, which came up before, and then maybe I'll get back to you later?
Yes, let me just say something very briefly. There is some evidence of debate in the Soviet Foreign Ministry or People's Commissariat of Foreign Affairs in the fall of 1945 about how to handle the proposal to set up negotiations at the UN. And there were different views expressed. And I think that Stimson's advice to Truman to make a direct approach to Stalin and not to do it through lesser powers was actually good advice and might have produced a different kind of discussion about the bomb. But I don't think it would have stopped Stalin from wanting to have the bomb as long as the United States had it. And Gromyko, in a book written by his son, tells his son, you know, he says, I'll tell you a secret. Stalin wanted a bomb of his own and didn't believe that Truman would give up the US bomb. And I think that was locked in a way, after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But the handling of it might have been somewhat different if Stimson's approach had been adopted.
Thank you very much, David, also for being so brief with your answer. Michael, would you like to ask your two questions to,
Sure.
to Marty now? Okay.
Thank you very much. Yeah, Marty, you begin the book with a reflection on luck in history, and you quote the famous remark by Dean Acheson that it was only plain dumb luck that saw us safely through this crisis. I've sort of looked at the same period that you have, and I have a slightly different take on it, which is, I think it wasn't dumb luck, it was intelligent luck, because leaders make their own luck. And, you know, we had the good fortune in 1962 to have, at least in Moscow and Washington, fairly reasonable leaders who had been through experienced war themselves. And, you know, one of the contributions of JFK was that he didn't pay too much attention to Acheson. Acheson wanted to bomb the missile sites in Cuba, and had JFK followed that advice, then we might have been drawn into an escalating nuclear war. So one of JFK's you know, virtues was a sense of humility, and he understood that he was playing with fire, and that's why, as you relate in the book, he and Khrushchev moved rapidly to bring the crisis to an end after just a few days. So my question for you is, you know, really researching this book, what has it made you think about the role of individuals in history, and specifically during the Cuban Missile Crisis?
Well, thank you, Michael. First of all, your comment about dumb luck versus intelligent luck. I began to first think about the role of luck in the Cuban Missile Crisis, reading a terrific book about the Cuban Missile Crisis. I think it was called 1 Minute to Midnight. And I think it was written by somebody who has a name similar to yours. You know, whether it's dumb luck or intelligent luck, there's the element of luck, which I think is critical in everything, and that historians don't really know how to fully integrate into their work in these issues. So that's the first point. The second point would be to make sure I don't waste time and go around your question. What the question again, specifically?
Right. The question is, what was the role of individuals, in particular Khrushchev and Kennedy, during the crisis? And if we'd had other leaders, Eisenhower or Nixon, would it have made a difference?
Absolutely. I mean, the bottom line is that individuals are absolutely central to how history works out. And that's not only in the Cuban Missile Crisis. I mean, that's why I began the book with the debate between Burns and Stimson, with Truman in there. If Roosevelt had been in there, things would have been different. If Stevenson had won the 1952 presidential election, the whole 1950s would have been totally different. If Nixon had won in 1960, everything would have been different. First of all, I think the Bay of Pigs would have been backed up by U.S. Troops. The individuals who controlled American foreign policy and Soviet foreign policy was central to how that foreign policy played out.
Okay, well, thank you.
Your last questions?
Yeah. So the last question is, you begin with a kind of interesting anecdotes about your own experiences during the missile crisis when you were a junior officer. And you're sort of rather humble about this, but in fact, it reminded me of JFK's experiences as a lieutenant junior grade in the Second World War. When I gave talks about the missile crisis, people often said, well, he was only a lieutenant junior grade. He was right at the bottom. That military experience wasn't really relevant. But actually, I think it's much more relevant, or equally as relevant, but from a different perspective, as senior military experience, because the lesson that JFK took from his military experience was the military always screws up, as he put it. He understood that how things could go wrong. So my question is about the command and control of nuclear weapons. And you have described a number of incidents, including the ones with the submarines, in which there wasn't much command and control from the top. Decisions during the missile crisis were devolved to captains and majors and a few people in submarines. And if they'd taken different decisions, behaved differently, then the outcome could have been different. Of course, there were no locks on nuclear weapons, on many nuclear weapons in those days, particularly tactical nuclear weapons. So my question is, now we have locks on nuclear weapons. I don't think a major can fire a nuclear weapon in the way they could during the Cuban Missile Crisis. But do we have any better command and control over nukes than we did back in the 60s? Can we be reassured by all the changes that have happened since then?
Marty, please try to be as brief as possible in your answers, since we need to give time also to the other commentators and the rest of the audience to ask questions.
Okay, very briefly, the command and control has been improved, certainly since the Cuban Missile Crisis, but whether or not it has been improved to the point where an accident cannot happen is very questionable. And I don't have the answer to that.
Thank you, Marty. David, thank you for your patience. Would you like to go on with your first comment or question?
Well, my first comment had to do with luck, because I was looking at Michael Dobbs's book last night and to refresh my memory of it. And I found that the last paragraph says it's unfair to use Atchison's expression, pure dumb luck. But we've had that discussion, and I think it's actually a rather it's a complex issue. But let me ask a different question. But first of all, I know we're told not to heap praise on Marty, but I can't resist saying first how glad I am to be in this seminar with the NPIHP community. Secondly, this seminar on Marty's book, which I think is wonderful. And let me just say a few words of praise. The writing is fantastic. And I think that's what really struck me. The research, of course, is excellent, but the way in which the tension and uncertainty of the crisis is conveyed, even though to the reader, even though we know the outcome, is I think, masterful. And the way in which the characters are brought to life with a mixture of empathy and kind of criticism or critical intelligence is really very striking. So one question I have is about the domestic politics of Kennedy's reaction to the Khrushchev's placement of the missiles in Cuba. A number of accounts pay quite a lot of attention to that, that he made the commitment that there weren't going to be missiles there. The midterm elections were coming up. It's really driven in some sense by domestic politics rather than national security. But you don't give a great deal of emphasis to that. In fact, you have him saying, "Oh, I wish I had never said there would be no missiles in Soviet missiles in Cuba." And I'm just wondering, how did you change? Was that something you changed your mind on? Because what you convey is much more that it was a national security crisis. It wasn't driven by domestic politics. There were real consequences to the actions that Kennedy took during the crisis. If he had said, "Oh, let's not pay any attention," what I think you implied earlier, Khrushchev might have moved on Berlin. Or, of course, if he had attacked straight away, that could have had other consequences. So I was just interested in what your view is of that kind of analysis of Kennedy's response.
Thank you, David. I just wanted to encourage the audience to write their questions on the Zoom chat. Please direct brief questions to Marty. Thank you.
Thank you, David, for the very generous remarks and for the question. I'm glad you brought that up because I think I may have buried my view about the influence of domestic politics more than I thought I did. There's a very short chapter that focuses on Robert and Jack, where Bobby says, "You would have been impeached if you didn't do it." And I point out that he wouldn't have been impeached, he just would have lost the '64 election. And that was the major issue. And in the conclusion, I point out that, in fact, McNamara and Kennedy agreed that the missiles in Cuba didn't make any strategic difference. But nevertheless, the president was not going to sacrifice his political career to the situation that Khrushchev put him in. So domestic politics were absolutely critical. And I would say in general, my view is that most foreign policy is rooted in domestic politics.
Okay. May I
Yes.
come back at that, Jordana?
Yeah, if you can very briefly, thank you.
Yeah,
And
no,
maybe Svetlana has some follow-up.
Yeah, I'm interested in that because, I mean, I remember the chapter where, you know, the Bobby Kennedy thing, you would have been impeached, and you say exactly, well, he would have lost the '64 election. But on the other hand, what doesn't come through is a kind of, at least it didn't come through to me from reading the book, the idea that Kennedy was just willing to risk a world war in order to be sure to win the '64 election, because the kind of reasoning that goes on about the crisis, about what would Khrushchev do, what does this mean, that is intense, and it strikes me as a serious discussion. It's perfectly possible to say, oh, it doesn't make a big difference, and let's take some measures in response, but not threaten, you know, to, or not go ahead, not threaten to take out the missiles or not impose a quarantine. But I'm still, I came out of it thinking your portrait of Kennedy was, in showing his faults and so on, was an admiring portrait compared with the people he was getting advice from. Maybe that's, and they were intelligent people. There wasn't a stupid set of people, but there were people operating on certain assumptions. I'm interested, yeah, I just thought that had less of a role in your explanation than it might have had. I'm not arguing, you know, one way or the other on it.
Yeah, well, thank you. Just very briefly, I did not intend when I started to write the Kennedy section, the Cuban Missile Crisis section of the book, to focus so much on the XCOM meetings and the tapes. But I felt I just kept getting drawn into them because when you looked very closely, you saw Kennedy's mind at work. And it really was a first-class mind. There's almost a shift, you could say, from the first several days of the Cuban Missile Crisis meeting, where he's kind of going along with the general view. We're going to have to bomb them, we're going to have to invade them, and so on. And then he begins to think about the consequences. And I think Adlai Stevenson stimulated that in a very important way. And then you begin to see the independence of this mind work. And I was always so impressed with, he kept saying, why did Khrushchev do it? You know, why, what is behind all of this? He always was trying to understand his adversary. And that was unusual. Nobody else in the XCOM seemed to give a damn. So it became a fascinating study of a very interesting mind.
I see that there is a bit of a discussion in the chat on domestic politics and before about luck. So after Svetlana's question, maybe you would like to, some of you would like to say something on that. If you want, just raise your hand. Svetlana?
I will follow a similar theme. on the role of individuals in the Cuban Missile Crisis and just generally in the nuclear history. I admire how Marty made these characters absolutely alive, and their words and their voices. And the character that came out, you know, from my reading of the book as the most interesting to me was Mcnamara. I wonder if you could say a couple of words about how you see Mcnamara's role, his contribution to the resolution of the crisis, and his evolution through the crisis, his nuclear learning. Thank you.
Actually, I was a bit appalled about Mcnamara. At the beginning, he is very much in charge, and he says a lot of sensible things. He's very attuned to the president, and he's inclined to follow the president's lead and back him up. But on the last couple of days of the crisis, during the most tense period where the possibility of nuclear war seems, you know, real, McNamara is all over the place. I mean, first he's, you know, we need to do things to bring Khrushchev diplomatically to a resolution. Then we need to attack. We got to get ready. I think McNamara panicked on Saturday the 27th, and Kennedy didn't. Kennedy was so clear by the end of the crisis, he was going to do anything. He was not going to allow those missiles in Turkey, those Jupiters in Turkey, to war if it could be prevented.
Okay. Thank you, Marty. Thank you, Svetlana. So we have a couple of comments on Stevenson. One from Thomas Vars, the other one from Ryan Musto. Thomas Vars just asked, why did Kennedy destroy Stevenson? Ryan wrote something a bit more lengthy than that. Ryan, would you like to add anything to Thomas' question? Ryan?
No, I'm fine. That's a perfect way to sum it up. Thank you.
Okay, great. Marty, did you understand the question?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Yes. Kennedy did not like Stevenson, to put it mildly. Stevenson had opposed his bid to be the vice presidential candidate in 1956. In 1960, Stevenson had refused to support Kennedy's bid for the presidency. And I have a chapter about this, you know, the complicated relationship. Why did Kennedy pick him for the UN ambassador? Well, Stevenson was the leader of the liberal wing of the Democratic Party, and Kennedy needed Stevenson sort of in the tent, so to speak, rather than being outside the tent. And Stevenson was seen by Bobby and by Robert as a potential threat, as still having presidential ambitions. And during the Cuban Missile Crisis, his performance at the United Nations was very dramatic. And I think that Kennedy simply wanted to crush Stevenson. And it was the worst part of Kennedy's personality. And in the conclusion of the book, I talk about this, that, you know, once it was all over, Kennedy drifted back to his tough political personality and just went after Stevenson very successfully, as it turned out.
Okay, we have a couple of questions. One from one from Melvin Leffler, and the other one from James Ashberg. I don't know if either David or Svetlana want to add anything urgently, or maybe yes, Svetlana, please.
Not urgently. I have another question, so maybe let other people ask their questions.
Thank you. So Leffler's question is, what conclusion did Kennedy come to? Why did Khrushchev do it?
Say that again, please.
What conclusion did Kennedy come to? Why did Khrushchev do it?
Oh,
why Khrushchev?
Okay. Well, first of all, if that's from Mel Leffler and Jim Hirschberg, I want everybody to know these guys read this manuscript when it was in kind of rough shape, and both of them contributed a great deal to improving it. I want to thank you. Now, what conclusion did Kennedy come to? Kennedy was convinced that Khrushchev was using the missiles in Cuba to influence, to eventually force the Americans and the British and the French out of Berlin. He had this idée fixe about Berlin being Khrushchev's ultimate goal. It turned out it was probably wrong, arguably. Now, I know there are like others who think that was Khrushchev's ultimate goal, but I don't think so. But Kennedy thought so.
Okay, we did the question from, I think Melvin Leffler has a 2 finger on that. 2 fingers? No. Yeah, yes, please.
Marty, I just was wondering, when we use the phrase that it was about Berlin, and that really was not Khrushchev's intention, I think we don't differentiate or really understand that we use Berlin as a shorthand for really talking about the whole future of Germany.
Right.
And I think that Khrushchev was hugely interested in the future of Germany. And I think that's confirmed in the correspondence with Kennedy at the very end of the Cuban Missile Crisis, when he says, once again, now that we've resolved this, let's get back to talk about the real issues that bother me. And the most important one is the future of Germany.
There's no question that the Soviets, I mean, you didn't have to be Khrushchev, all the Soviets wanted to be sure that Germany did not rearm and did not threaten the Soviet Union again. And so, yes, that was an ultimate goal. But I think after the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was a relaxation of focus on Germany. And talking about the importance of individuals, if Kennedy had not been assassinated, it's possible a more accommodating relationship would have developed in Kennedy's second presidential term.
Okay, I would like to jump for a second to a question posed by Deepak, and then I'll go back to the other questions, because he's asking something about individuals. Deepak, would you like to ask your own question?
Yeah, sure thing. Hello all. So my question for Marty is, if there was any other leader in the Soviet Union other than Khrushchev, would we still have the Cuban Missile Crisis? Just in terms of what you were saying earlier about the Hiroshima to the Cuban Missile Crisis, I was thinking, well, if the systemic factors are present anyway, then do we have the crisis even without Khrushchev? What is your view on this? And maybe David's view as well on this.
Well, that's very interesting. First of all, I want to compliment you on your background. Where are you? It's beautiful.
California.
Oh, I see. Okay. I think that the Cuban Missile Crisis was very much a product of Khrushchev's personality. You know, I remember that during one of the Presidium meetings when Khrushchev proposed sneaking missiles into Cuba, Mikoyan said, this is not a good idea. This could destroy all of our Cuban policies. We could lose Cuba because of this. But Khrushchev was just much more, he was a gambler. You know, this is the silver bullet. I've got the answer to everything. And you know what? If he had succeeded, it would have been as successful an intervention as MacArthur's landing in Incheon for the Korean War. He gambled and he lost.
David, Svetlana, would you like to add anything to that on Khrushchev?
Yeah.
I think I agree that if there was another leader, we were not likely to have the Cuban Missile Crisis. I think
I fear that your microphone is not working. At least I cannot hear you.
I'm not muted.
Now it's fine. Now it's fine.
Anyway, that is strange. So yeah, very quickly. I think I agree with Marty that if Khrushchev was not there, we would not have the deployment of missiles to Cuba. But I would like to add that Kennedy was also a gambler. And so when they faced each other and realized that this was a very high stakes gamble, they both came to the conclusion that they were not gonna push this to a resolution that could be very disastrous for the mankind. And they, in their gambling minds, they immediately pulled back, both of them.
Could I follow up? We shouldn't forget that Khrushchev expressed great admiration for John Foster Dulles, and particularly was struck by Dulles's interview in Look magazine, I think early in 1956, where he talked about going to the brink. And this wasn't only when Khrushchev was in retirement. He uses it during he mentions his admiration for Dulles in a meeting of Warsaw Pact leaders during the Berlin crisis. The thing was that Dulles was willing to pressure, but he knew there was a brink and he wouldn't cross the brink. And so I think Kennedy and Khrushchev didn't trust each other, and indeed in some ways may have misunderstood each other rather badly. But one thing they do seem to have shared was a mutual belief that the other understood how catastrophic a nuclear war would be. In other words, there was a brink. And I think they could have slid over it in the Cuban crisis. And I think that's one of the things that comes through very strongly in Marty's book. But that was a very important element of trust, or at least of knowledge. And I agree, actually. I think with another leader, one might not have had that, or one might have had it done in a different way. What if Khrushchev had followed Fidel's advice and said, let's conclude a defense treaty, and then we'll announce we're going to deploy the missiles in Cuba, just as you've done in Turkey, because these are our ally. What would the US response have been then? The same, I guess, because the US attitude to Cuba was pretty proprietorial, not to say imperialistic.
I agree.
Okay. Jim Hershberg and then Sergei Radchenko. Jim Hershberg, would you like to ask your?
Thank you very much, and congratulations, Marty. It's great to see this coming out after all these years. Two very quick questions. One is, and this is something we've talked about for decades, and I'm curious if you found anything different. How much do you think Tuchman's Guns of August actually influenced JFK's thinking during the missile crisis? Anything to add to what we've said for 50 years about how accentuated his worry about contingency? And second,
Wait, well, let me answer that.
Okay, fine.
The answer is no. I was surprised that it wasn't mentioned in the XCOM meetings, and I never saw it mentioned anywhere else. So I have nothing more to contribute.
Okay, and since you mentioned contingencies, I've always thought, at least ever since the 1990s when it came out, that had Khrushchev only sent the tactical nuclear weapons to Cuba, which could not have reached the United States in most cases, then the US would have had a really hard time compelling their removal. And I'm curious if you agree with that. But second, since his name came up, what about the counterfactual that Mikoyan, as another Soviet leader who was then #2, had suddenly replaced Khrushchev? Would that have led to a rapid possibility of an end to the Cold War, given that Mikoyan was such a more sensible character than Khrushchev? Of course, Sveta, who knew Mikoyan through his son very well about the missile crisis, might also want to comment on that.
Well, Mikoyan was a very impressive advisor and seemed to be the most informed and cautious and clever of all the people that I'm familiar with in the Presidium. But David and Svetlana would be able to answer this much better. In terms of what was the other part of your question?
Jim, your microphone is muted.
What if Khrushchev had only sent the tactical nuclear weapons?
Oh, right. Well, I think if he sent tactical nuclear weapons, there wouldn't have been a Cuban Missile Crisis. Because they were defensive weapons. And Kennedy had said that he would accept defensive weapons. Now, he would have created a problem for Kennedy, political problem, because those defensive weapons had nuclear warheads on them. Nevertheless, I don't think there would have been a Cuban Missile Crisis.
Okay.
What about Svetlana and David answering the question?
Svetlana, David? Svetlana, I think you're muted.
I am unmuted now. Am I? Can you hear me? Okay. It's a very unlikely counterfactual, Jim, and I do think if Mikoyan was in power, he probably, and most likely, he would find a way to at least relax the tensions, if not end the Cold War. He already was in America in 1936. He came back and he gave this incredible report to the Presidium saying basically, you know what, instead of fighting America and blasting them and criticizing them, why don't we first emulate them? And when we get to the level of their development, then we will try to overtake them. So he already had this very positive image of America. He had good relationships with members of Kennedy administration and other influential Americans. And of course, it was the Cuban on the Politburo. So he was such an incredible diplomat that I think he would have found a different way to talk to the Kennedy administration. But, you know, Mikoyan really did not have political ambitions, as far as I know from, you know, the best, I don't know, sources. His son and Khrushchev himself mentioned that, Khrushchev's son mentioned that to me too. He did not have any independent political base. So that is why this counterfactual, I think, is so far removed from reality. And in the presidium that we have, I don't think there were any other people who were reasonable enough and willing to negotiate with the United States and able to negotiate with the United States. Even Gromyko, with all his experience, was not the kind of person who would end the Cold War. So the counterfactual is not very likely. But if Kennedy was not killed, if Kennedy lived, I think having lived through the Cuban Missile Crisis, with the nuclear learning that they had, Kennedy and Khrushchev could have come close to not ending the Cold War, but maybe improving relations significantly within the framework of the Cold War.
David, do you have?
No, I don't have anything to add.
Thank you.
I just want to add one thing. As Svetlana was talking, it occurred to me that Mikoyan was kind of a precursor to Gorbachev. You know, and it's interesting that that kind of thinking was embedded somewhere in Soviet high places way back in the 1960s. No, David? No. Okay.
Okay. Sergei Radchenko now, and he has anything to add to what he wrote in the chat, and then Benoit Pelopina.
Hi. Thanks very much. A really fascinating discussion. So great to see old friends. On that last point about what would have happened, for example, if Kennedy had lived, etc. You know, in 1960, remember that discussion about Gary Powers and how if, for example, Eisenhower did not flare up in that Paris meeting, etc., you could have ended the Cold War right there. In 1960, it turns out that even before Khrushchev went to Paris, or supposedly to end the Cold War, whatever he was trying to do there, he already decided that he could not actually go beyond certain red line in his concessions to the Americans, because he had, you know, he was playing for gains, but he also realized that he couldn't. His own credibility and his own legitimacy depended on being the leader of socialism and on sort of pursuing a particular kind of foreign policy. So I think that there's a limitation there to how much Khrushchev would have been willing to give away if Kennedy had lived. So I would you know, very humbly disagree on this. But actually, a question for Marty, and maybe also for Svetlana. Svetlana actually would have a lot to say on that, and David as well. There's a tendency to, in the historiography, I think, to see Khrushchev as the bad guy, as the reckless gambler. He puts missiles into Cuba, etc. But as we look at the Soviet decision-making, we see that actually a lot of that decision-making was very reasonable, and Khrushchev was rightly upset about Turkey, was rightly upset about Italy. There was Japan there as well, with their with American nuclear weapons there threatening the Soviet Union. So from the Soviet perspective, it was sort of a matter of just kind of sovereign equality. So would you say that Khrushchev was morally and politically justified in sending missiles to Cuba?
Well, I don't want to get into the moral issue, but politically, Khrushchev had a job to do, which was to promote Soviet, you know, security and Soviet ambitions, and he did it in a way that was sometimes imaginative, sometimes dangerous, and sometimes very sensible. He was an extraordinary, interesting leader of the Soviet Union. I find him, much more, well, interesting isn't the word I'm looking for, but I find him a leader who Kennedy could have worked with when they both got on the same wavelength, which they were moving on to after the Cuban Missile Crisis. Khrushchev, I don't think was a bad guy. Quite the contrary. His "we will bury you," became a battle cry for American anti-communists. They're really after us. But all it was saying, we're going to compete and we're going to leave you in the dust. And, anti-communism in America was hysterical. And anything that Khrushchev did was used as a club, to whip him with in American politics.
Okay, we have about 10, 12 minutes. So if you have questions, please type them in the chat. Now I would like to move to, we have a couple of questions on luck, one from Benoit Peropida and the other one from Abner Cohen. I'm going to read them, and then if you want to add anything, you can just talk and unmute yourself. So Benoit asked, how do you distinguish the role of luck from political leadership? And Abner asked, what were the other one of two occasions that we played with luck between 45-52, if any? And I don't know if
62.
Abner, 52, sorry. If Abner or Benoit would like to add anything to that.
I mean, I can say in one sentence why I'm asking the question and why that's important. But so essentially, very briefly, the point of making luck distinguishable and researchable is to avoid the trap that Marty started, pointing at, which is the illusion of controllability. From the moment when we talk about luck, we essentially put it back onto, oh, that's skillful leadership. Then we've talked about luck, but we haven't accounted for it. That's why the distinction is important. So I want to know how he makes it.
Yeah, and what I would like to add to the question is, assuming the book is beyond just the Cuban crisis, what are the other points, 1, 2, or 3 from 45 to 62, that you find a moment that we really gamble with luck, gamble with the bomb?
Well, I think that that Hiroshima itself was a gamble. James Burns, the Secretary of State, who I think was most responsible for influencing Truman's willingness to use nuclear weapons, was convinced that the demonstration that we had a monopoly of this new weapon would bring the Soviet Union under control. It would bring Stalin to his knees, so to speak. That was a terrible gamble, and it worked out very badly. All of Eisenhower administration nuclear policy, I think, was a disaster, and we were lucky that Khrushchev understood that a nuclear war, a nuclear confrontation, would be a disaster. There was no incident before the Cuban Missile Crisis where I think luck played as central a role in preventing a nuclear war between the United States and the Soviet Union. But throughout the 1950s, certainly, when both the Soviet Union and the United States were playing massive retaliation policies back and forth with each other. Bad luck could have, triggered a confrontation, mainly in Berlin. Lots of incidents where, in Berlin, where that could have happened. Certainly, in, what was it, October 1961, where the tanks are facing each other in Berlin. Well, what if, a Soviet or an American private sitting in a tank had decided, whoops, they're going to fire first and press the button. Could have happened. Kennedy wasn't in charge. Khrushchev wasn't in charge. So I think luck is there all the time.
Svetlana, David, do you have any comment on this? I think Svetlana had a question.
I just
thought on that. Yes, David, please.
I just wrote a question.
Yeah.
Marty, do you think, based on your study of that initial period, early period where luck was so important, with the deterioration and really almost disappearance of the entire arms control structure now, especially of verification of the channels between Russia and the United States to talk, are we running out of luck?
Well, luck drains away instantly. It's not like it's a smooth flowing, river that, at some point begins to trickle down and run out of water. 1 minute the river's running, just fine, and then all of a sudden there's a crevasse and the water falls down. So it's not a question of running out of luck. It's a question of, are we creating these crevasses that will plunge us into a disastrous situation?
Plus, if we're talking about the role of individuals, we're talking about the role of individuals, the role of leaders, the quality of leadership, and if we look at today, we need a lot of luck.
Well, yeah, we need a lot of luck, given the kind of leadership we have. Yes.
Okay, David, do you have any?
I wanted to follow up on Benoit's question, because I think the issue of controllability or uncontrollability is crucial. So if there are situations that are uncontrollable in some fundamental existential way, then even good leadership can't resolve it, because good leadership can only affect, I think, what can be controlled. At least I take that's an implication of Benoit's question. So good leadership doesn't solve the problem, because not everything is amenable to correction or stabilization as a result of leadership.
I go back to something McGeorge Bundy said to me once, and that was, crisis managers cannot control everything. And, there's a limit, everything is compartmentalized. What the Joint Chiefs do, what the president does, and then it works down, all the way down to some private, who happens to have a tactical nuclear weapon in his control. And if he fires it, everything that the upper levels of government try to control goes down the drain.
Thank you. Okay, we have a few minutes and a couple of questions, and then I think that Melvin Leffler wanted to say something. So Alex Bellerstein, please keep it brief.
Hi, thanks. All I really wanted to say was what I put in the chat, which is we had a really interesting discussion about Stalin and the early Cold War and Truman, and this is an old question, but I'm just really wondering if the panel, and Marty and David I have in mind, but others as well, given Stalin and Truman, no imagining Truman out of the picture or something like that, is there any way that you can imagine avoiding a nuclear arms race realistically? What are the conditions that would exist that would do that? And I'm just curious what you have in mind, but I'm looking for not sort of vague, yes, they were committed, yes, they weren't, but really what would have had to have changed for it to go in a different direction, realistically speaking, if anything? Thanks a bunch.
I think Truman would have had to have changed, number one. Number two, you know, his decision to use the atomic bomb would have had to have been totally different. I think if the United States had nuclear weapons and we had refused to use them, and after the war, Stimson had, you know, appeared before Congress and made the argument that the United States would never use such a weapon, and it's not within the framework of our values. Nuclear weapons are beyond the pale. And if we had done that, and we had committed to getting rid of our 2 nuclear weapons that we had at that leftover, I think things could have been different. I can't see why Stalin would have gone into a crash program to build nuclear weapons in that very, very different environment.
Thank you. Okay, Ruth Van Dyke, if you want to ask the last question very, very briefly, because we are really running out of time.
Oh, thank you. This was that came to my mind when we were talking about Eisenhower's policies, and I just had to think it's another way maybe of getting at the luck issue that Eisenhower, because of the large lead in the nuclear arms race, could perhaps do some of these things, think some of these things with a little more confidence, knowing that the Soviets were so far behind and that they were likely to be more careful than in a different and more equal situation.
Is that? I mean, that's a good comment. I'm not sure what to answer it. I think Eisenhower started off his administration with about 12 or 1,400 nuclear weapons. He ended it with about 22,000 nuclear weapons. Everything that we have lived with since then, I think, has been the result of the Eisenhower administration's commitment to putting nuclear weapons in the forefront of American foreign policy. And I think that Khrushchev's policies were very reactive to the Eisenhower administration's policies.
Okay, Svetlana or David, would you like to say something, some final remarks? Otherwise, I'll leave it to briefly to Melvin Leffler, who wanted to add something. But David, you were about to say something.
No, but then when you mentioned Mel, let's let Mel have the last word.
Okay.
Well, I wanted to say 2 things. One, I wanted to address Avner's question to Marty about what does the book add for the whole period, 1945 to 62. And one of the compelling aspects of the book, I would say, is that he shows throughout how much perceptions of the strategic balance of power really mattered in the decision-making at various times, and how that shapes the whole mentality of decision making. But why I wanted to just make a remark at the end was to say that I really feel that Jim Hirschberg and I, although we only talked about it once while the book was in process, really were actually quite fortunate to have had the privilege to read and comment on this book. And for those of you who haven't seen it yet, I just really wanted to say, this is a truly wonderful book. It's wonderful because it's just masterfully organized, it's elegantly written, and it's substantively argued throughout. And very few books really, I think, combine all these traits. And for all of us who are constantly struggling to write good books, compelling books, one can really learn an amazing amount from just seeing the way Marty orchestrates this book. It's really quite imaginatively conceptualized and presented. This is really a terrific book. And Marty, congratulations. I'm glad you took all the time you did to write this type of a book. We will all benefit.
Thank you.
Okay, I need to be brutal because we need to wrap this up. So I think I'll leave to Leopoldo Nuti to close the meeting if he wants to add some.
Okay, thank you, Jordana. Thanks, everybody. Just a very, very brief comment. Mel said what I just wanted to say about the book. It shouldn't come as a surprise that the book is beautifully written, given that the author is a Pulitzer Prize winner, but it is beautifully written, and it's a very elegant book. So I strongly encourage all of you who haven't had a chance to read it to do so at the first opportunity. And I think I can only repeat what I said at the beginning. This was the ideal book to start the NPHP series of webinars. It's one about one of the most important episodes of the Cold War and of the nuclear age, perhaps the most important episode. And it's written by a fantastic scholar. So, I think it's an excellent start for a series. And I would like to thank everybody for patiently waiting your turn to ask your thoughtful questions and for attending the whole seminar. I would like to thank the Wilson Center staff for helping us to do this, and all my fellow partners in crime, Christian, Jordana, Pete, thanks a lot for everybody. And thanks, of course, to Marty for writing the book, and to the panelists, Michael, Svetlana, David, thanks a lot. I look forward to continuing this series, and I'll leave it to Christian, maybe for one final word.
No final word from me. Just okay. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, thank you.
Okay,
all.
so thanks.
Thank you, Svetlana. Thank you, David. Bye. Bye.
Bye, everybody.
I'd like to say thank you to everybody for the generous comments and your excellent questions. And my editor told me to tell everybody you can pre-order the book on Amazon. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, David.
What? We are not getting free copies?
Bye, everybody.